basically, we just want to ask you, what are you currently working on, your current research? Are you working on any books or projects?
All right, so I guess a couple of differing projects. The first, I've just finished up a piece on right-wing anti-Semitism in the 1970s, which focuses primarily on a House race in South Carolina. And we're living in an era in which I think we see the anti-Semitism on both the right and the left, but in the political culture, it's sort of become more of a left-wing phenomenon. But that's not the tradition in U.S. history. I mean, it's been almost exclusively a right-wing phenomenon in politics until relatively recently. And this was a race that featured, it was a rural South Carolina district, overwhelmingly Christian district, but where the Democratic nominee was a Jewish refugee from Nazi-occupied Austria, who had become, he traveled to the United States with nothing, wound up founding a factory, became a very wealthy man, and then was elected mayor of Greenville, South Carolina, which is the largest city in the upcountry, for 2 terms, and then ran for Congress in 1978. Looked as if he was going to win, and was ultimately subject to both a whispering campaign and really sort of overt anti-Semitic attacks. And it was sort of an early sign of the revival of this kind of coarse right-wing anti-Semitism that we've seen since. And this is an election that that everyone kind of knows about in congressional politics, because it was a notoriously dirty election, but where there hadn't been anything written on it, and I was able to get access to the candidate. Both candidates in the race have since passed away, but the families of the candidates, the campaign managers, and that sort of thing, and so I was able to reconstruct the race, which was, it was an interesting project, and one of several that I've been doing over the last couple of years on intriguing congressional elections in the 60s and 70s, and then into the 80s, which eventually I'll compile into a book. And then secondly, I did a law review last year that looked at the course of Title IX litigation up until 2019. I'm going to be working with my co-author for what amounts to a follow-up for that for 2020. It's an area where there's been sort of tons of litigation. There are new cases all the time. And then my last current piece, which is just finished up last week, is a book chapter on Congress and the military in the 1970s, which is it's a quite significant decade in terms of the congressional response to the military, because the decade begins with left-wing members of Congress trying to marshal congressional power in the military. And then by the end of the decade, it's right-wing members of Congress who are opposing Carter's policies, pushing for a more aggressive military posture. And so it's a decade where that's a particularly good illustration of the fact that congressional power is ideologically neutral. It can be used by forces on both the left and the right, depending on broader political culture and depending on the specific agendas of key members of Congress.
Wow, thank you. That sounds great, actually. Well, congrats on finishing the article. That sounds really good, and I'm looking forward to your new book. Is there anything else? I don't want to take up too much of your time.
No, I think not. I mean, one of the things for me and I suspect that all members of the department have sort of dealt with this in the virus era, is sort of how do you translate our research into a period where going to archives is not feasible anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I have, I think, something of an advantage over some of my colleagues in that I'm dealing with much more recent material. A lot of the sources that I use are already online source material, whether it's legal history or political history, or frankly, diplomatic history. All 3 of these subgenres in the US, at least, have been heavily moving to online documentation in the last 10 years. And so while it's true for me in terms of sort of straightforward congressional research, this is still archival research that requires going to the archives of the individual members of Congress and getting a sense of what they did. So for instance, for that anti-Semitism article, I had the Democratic candidates' papers were down at Furman University in Greenville. The Republican candidates' papers were at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. And so I went down to South Carolina for both of those. This was obviously before the virus.
Yeah.
This would not be possible now. But most of the source material that I work with, all of the legal stuff and a decent amount of the congressional stuff is available online. And so, one of the things that I've kind of thought about with, just sort of in my mind or in discussions with my father is to try to imagine, for me, what this process would have been like if the virus had hit 10 or 12 years ago, where we really were in a pre-internet age in terms of the availability of any kind of significant historical documents. And so, once we get to the end of this, hopefully will be sooner rather than later. I think one of the people who will be entitled to take a bow will be the archivists who had been pushing for several years to get material digitized and get material online, because without that, historical scholarship really would have all but ceased during this period. And at least for people in my areas, relatively recent U.S. Legal, political, diplomatic, there's enough there that's available that we're able to continue to do research. So I think we as historians owe, we always owe debts to the archivists because the archivists always are helping us do the research. But we really owe a debt in this case to archivists and librarians who in years past had fought for digitizing archives, creating online caches of documents, and now we're kind of benefiting from that during this period where everything is physically closed.